You know, usually when we talk about a nature story or like a story about wildlife migration, there's this underlying expectation of majesty.
Right. You picture the classic nature documentary setup.
Exactly. A massive flock of birds flying thousands of miles across the North American continent. They're guided by the stars, relying on the magnetic pull of the Earth. And, the music swells as they finally touch down on this pristine, isolated mountain lake to rest for the night.
It's the quintessential romantic image of the American West. Untouched wilderness providing sanctuary.
Yeah, but then you look at what actually happened in Butte, Montana in the late fall of 1995. Suddenly, that beautiful, sweeping nature documentary turns into, well, a dystopian horror film.
I mean, it really does. Because the landscape we are looking at in this specific historical event is, honestly, it's apocalyptic.
It remains the absolute definition of an industrial nightmare, one that completely subverts our understanding of the natural landscape. So picture this. It is late 1995. A massive flock of migrating snow geese is passing over Montana. And the weather suddenly turns vicious. Like a heavy, blinding snowstorm rolls in, and these exhausted birds desperately need a place to land and wait it out.
They need safety.
Right.
Hi.
So through the storm, they spot a massive body of water. And from the sky, it looks like a sanctuary. I mean, it's a lake, 900 feet deep, spanning over a mile across, tucked right into the geography of the mountains.
It looks perfect from 1,000 feet up.
Exactly. So they descend, thousands of them, and they splash down into the water. But this isn't a natural mountain lake carved by ancient glaciers. This is the Berkeley Pit.
And the water in the Berkeley Pit, chemically speaking, isn't really water anymore.
Not at all.
Not in any life-sustaining biological sense anyway.
Sure.
It is a highly concentrated, heavily acidic solution. We're talking about a pH level hovering between 2.5 and 4.5, depending on, the depth and the season.
Which is essentially like landing in a massive vat of diluted battery acid or like warm lemon juice heavily laced with dissolved toxic heavy metals.
Yeah, things like copper, arsenic, cadmium, zinc.
Tragically, hundreds of those geese died almost immediately. The necropsies showed their esophagi, and windpipes were just covered in chemical burns.
Horrific.
It really was a visceral, horrifying moment that forced the entire country to look at this massive toxic hole in the ground and ask, well, what on earth happened here?
And more importantly, for today's deep dive into our source material, it forces us to ask an even bigger, much more complicated question.
Right. The central question of accountability. Because the physical reality of the dead geese is shocking, but the financial and legal reality underlying that toxic lake, that's what truly impacts society at large.
Absolutely.
So today, we are going on a deep dive into a very specialized dossier of sources. We're going to look at the underlying mechanisms, the staggering multi-billion-dollar figures, and the incredibly complex corporate law surrounding abandoned mines in the United States.
There is a lot to cover.
There is. And our mission today, the central question I want you, the listener, to keep in the back of your mind for this entire conversation is this. When a massive industrial mine is poisoned, the surrounding landscape is permanently ruined, and the original corporate owner who dug the hole is long gone, who actually pays to clean it up.
That question sounds incredibly simple on its face. You would think the legal system has a straightforward answer.
You would hope so.
But, as our sources reveal, the reality is hidden behind an incredibly dense labyrinth of corporate structuring, bankruptcy codes, and, regulatory loopholes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the United States actually has a federal law designed specifically, almost explicitly, to answer this question.
Yes, circle.
Right, but most people know it as the Superfund law, and the core philosophical concept of Superfund is beautifully simple. The polluter pays. If you make the mess, you buy the mop.
That's the idea anyway.
Yeah, but our sources today detail the exact opposite outcome. They outline a legal and financial mechanism, an escape hatch, if you will, that allows massive multinational corporations to completely shed their liability.
And just walk away.
Exactly. And dump these toxic orphan sites straight onto the public ledger.
And that tension, that's the core of our entire analysis today. We are looking at a system where the statutory law says one thing in very bold letters, but corporate financial structuring achieves the exact opposite result.
It's wild.
It is a legally permissible, highly engineered way to sever the chain of responsibility.
And I really want to speak directly to you listening to this right now. This is not just some abstract, dry legal loophole that only matters to, like, corporate lawyers arguing in high-rises.
No, it affects everyone.
It's a mechanism where the ultimate safety net, the final absolute backstop for billions of dollars in toxic cleanup, is your wallet.
It's the taxpayer.
Yeah. You are the one underwriting the end of the line for these industrial operations. So to really understand how these companies manage to escape this liability, we first have to understand the formidable law they are actively trying to escape. Because Superfund, on paper, is supposed to be ironclad.
Oh, Congress designed it to be absolutely terrifying for polluters.
Terrifying how?
Well, to understand the corporate escape hatch, we must first look at the foundation. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, CERCLA.
Okay.
Congress wrote this law following major public outcries over toxic waste sites, like Love Canal in New York, for example.
Right, that was huge in the news back then.
Exactly. So the premise they landed on was aggressive. The party that created the hazardous contamination, or even the party that simply bought the contaminated asset years later, should be the one to pay for the cleanup.
It sounds totally fair to the average person. You break it, you buy it.
They went much further than just you break it, you buy it, though.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the liability under CERCLA is intentionally aggressively broad. There are three key pillars to how it works legally, and we need to understand them to see why corporations work so hard to circumvent them.
Okay, lay them out for me.
The first pillar is that the liability is strict.
Meaning what exactly in a legal context? Because normally to sue someone successfully, you have to prove they did something wrong, right? Like they were negligent.
Exactly. But under strict liability, there is no requirement to prove negligence.
None at all?
None. The government does not have to go to court and prove that a mining company was acting recklessly, or that they blatantly broke the safety protocols of the day, or, that they were maliciously cutting corners to save a buck.
So they could have been trying their best.
Doesn't matter. If your hazardous chemicals are in the ground, you are liable for the cleanup, period. Your intent simply doesn't matter. Your adherence to the rules of the time doesn't matter.
Wow. Okay, so strict liability means absolutely no excuses. You can't argue we didn't mean to or we thought it was safe.
Precisely.
What's the second pillar?
The second pillar is that the liability is joint and several.
Joint and several. Okay.
This is a massive legal hammer wielded by the EPA. It means that if multiple companies contributed to a massive toxic site over several decades, say 5 different mining operators using the exact same valley for waste, the government does not have to perfectly divide up the bill based on who dumped what percentage of the waste.
Hey, really? So they don't have to figure out, like, company A dumped 20%, company B dumped 30%.
No, they don't. If the government can only find one solvent party, meaning one company that still has money and still legally exists, they can hold that single company responsible for 100% of the total cleanup costs.
But wait, let me challenge that for a second. If I own a company that contributed, say, just 5% of the pollution to a site, but all the other companies that dumped the other 95% went out of business 50 years ago, the government can just hand me the entire multi-million-dollar bill.
They can.
That seems totally disproportionate.
It is entirely disproportionate to your specific contribution. But the logic Congress applied was societal.
How so?
They decided that the taxpayer shouldn't be left holding the bag just because the math of dividing the blame is too complicated, or because the worst offenders disappeared into history. The burden of finding the other polluters and suing them for their share falls on the company left standing, not the government.
That is wild. It's like, okay, it's like going to dinner with 10 people. Everyone orders lobster and champagne, and then they all sneak out the back door.
That's a great analogy.
And the restaurant hands you the bill for the entire table just because you're the only one left sitting there.
Exactly. You're at the table, so you pay for the table.
Okay. Strict and joint and several. What is the third pillar?
The third is perhaps the most controversial of all, and it has been fought over in courts for decades.
Okay.
The liability is retroactive. It reaches back in time to cover pollution that was completely legal when it happened.
Okay, that feels huge. So a mining company could have been following every single environmental law on the books in, say, 1950.
Yep.
They were doing everything by the book, exactly how the state and federal government told them to. They had permits. But because CERCLA passed in 1980, they can retroactively be billed for what they did 30 years prior when it was perfectly legal.
That is the reality of the statute. And crucially, This retroactive liability applies to successors and current owners.
Successors, meaning whoever buys it.
Yes. If Company A dug the mine and created the toxic tailings in 1950, and Company B buys Company A in 1970 because they want their equipment or their land, Company B inherits the full liability when Superfund passes in 1980. They legally stand in the shoes of the original polluter.
So it's like a liability virus.
A liability virus. That's a good way to put it.
It infects the physical asset, and whoever buys the asset or whoever buys the company that owns the asset catches the virus, even if they had absolutely nothing to do with the original operation.
That is how an oil company that has never mined a single ounce of copper in its entire corporate existence can end up legally mandated to pay for the cleanup of a massive copper mine.
Yeah.
They bought the company that dug the hole, so they bought the history.
Okay, so Congress builds this seemingly inescapable, terrifying fortress of a law. Strict, joint, and several, retroactive, and it follows the chain of ownership endlessly. It sounds like there's absolutely no way out for industry.
It was designed to look that way.
So how is there a way out? How does this corporate escape hatch actually work against a law that strong?
Well, the escape hatch relies on a single defining economic reality in all of this, the word solvent.
Solvent, meaning they have money.
Exactly. Circle A can only extract money from a potentially responsible party that still legally exists and actually has capital.
Right.
If there is no money, the ironclad law has nothing to grab onto.
Yeah.
So the mechanism outlined in our dossier isn't about breaking the law. It's about the completely lawful, highly strategic use of corporate structure and bankruptcy to defeat CERCLA.
Okay, I really want to dive into the mechanics of this. How do they actually execute it? It sounds like you're describing a deliberate financial vanishing act.
I mean, that's exactly what it is. Our sources break this down into a sequence, a 4-step playbook that utilizes the basic foundations of corporate law.
Step 1.
Step 1 is to isolate the liability.
Okay.
Let's say you are a massive, wealthy parent corporation. You have a sprawling portfolio of healthy, highly profitable assets all over the world. But you also own an aging, highly contaminated mine that is nearing the end of its productive life.
Right. It's about to stop making money.
Yes. And you absolutely do not want the looming massive cleanup bill for that one dying mine threatening the profits of your healthy assets. So you place that specific mine into a discrete, legally separate subsidiary, a shell company, essentially.
I think I see where this is going. It reminds me of like a real estate analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say I want to rent a really nice, expensive apartment, but I know I'm going to throw raging parties every weekend and completely destroy the place. So I don't sign the lease in my own name, risking my own bank account. Instead, I set up a dummy LLC. Let's call it Host Speaker Enterprises LLC.
Nice ring to it.
Thanks. I fund it with exactly enough money to pay the first month's rent and the security deposit. And the LLC is the legal entity that signs the lease.
Perfect. The LLC becomes the entity holding the obligation, which leads perfectly to step 2 of the corporate playbook, undercapitalizing that subsidiary.
So keeping it broke.
Exactly. The shell company holds the depreciating dying mine, and it holds the massive looming environmental obligation. But the parent company makes sure the subsidiary holds very little actual cash.
Just enough to scrape by.
Yeah. And crucially, the parent company does not provide a formal financial guarantee to backstop the subsidiary's debts.
Okay, so back to my apartment. I move in, I throw the parties, I smash the drywall, I ruin the plumbing, the landlord comes in, sees hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage, and naturally sues my LLC because that's the name on the lease.
And this triggers step 3. In the real world, the ore at the mine eventually runs out. The revenue completely stops. The expensive water pumps that keep the toxic groundwater at bay are turned off to save money, and the real environmental disaster begins.
The bill comes due.
The cleanup bill comes due. The subsidiary, which has no money by design, simply throws its hands up and declares bankruptcy.
Just like that.
Just like that. In bankruptcy court, environmental cleanup claims become what are known as unsecured debts.
What does that mean for the cleanup?
It means they are pushed to the very back of the line behind secured creditors, like the banks that lent the company money for equipment. And if those environmental claims get paid at all, it's usually just pennies on the dollar.
And my LLC just says to the landlord, oops, I have $0 in my bank account. I declare bankruptcy. The LLC dissolves into thin air. Meanwhile, I, the actual person who threw the parties and enjoyed the apartment, am sitting on my personal bank account, which is completely full and untouched.
Yep.
And because of the corporate veil, the landlord can't touch my personal money.
Exactly. The final result is step 4. The site is orphaned.
Orphan.
The corporate entity that owned the mine is dead. The wealthy parent company is protected by the corporate veil, and there is no solvent responsible party left for CERCLA to catch.
So the law is useless.
The contamination and the perpetual infinite cost of managing it falls to the state environmental department, to the EPA, and ultimately to the taxpayer.
But wait, isn't the whole point of corporate law to protect investors? I mean, if we start piercing the corporate veil every time a company goes bankrupt just to pay for environmental damage, doesn't that threaten the entire foundation of the economy?
That is the exact defense of this system.
Because no one would ever invest in anything if their personal assets were always on the line.
Right. The entire historical purpose of creating a corporation or an LLC is to limit liability, to encourage investment and risk-taking. Without limited liability, modern capitalism as we know it wouldn't exist.
Sure, that makes sense on a macro level.
But when you apply that general economic concept to massive, permanent environmental destruction, the results are staggering.
How so?
In economics, we call this an externality, a cost suffered by a third party. But here, the externality is made brutally literal and permanent.
Okay, break that down for me.
The financial gains, the profits from selling the copper or the gold for decades, were privatized by the parent company while the mine was producing. But the loss, the chemical liability, the acid rock drainage that will continue to poison the watershed essentially forever is socialized once the mine stops producing.
So the profit is entirely private. The pollution is entirely public.
Privatize the gains, socialize the losses.
It's a phrase you hear thrown around a lot in finance, but seeing it engineered step by step in the physical environment is really something else. So this brings us back to our starting point.
The Berkeley Pit.
The Berkeley Pit in Butte, Montana, the place where the snow geese landed in the toxic lake. But what's fascinating about the Berkeley Pit, according to our dossier, is that the corporate escape hatch mechanism we just outlined actually failed to protect the parent company there.
That's right. The Berkeley Pit is the textbook, canonical case of the chain of liability actually holding together across decades.
Which is rare, right?
Extremely rare. It is the massive exception that proves the rule, and it only held because the companies involved in the chain were simply too massive and too diversified to quietly go bankrupt and disappear.
I really want to trace this corporate genealogy because we have a giant hole in the ground that was dug by one specific company over decades, but the ultimate cleanup bill was paid by companies that didn't dig it at all. How did we get there legally?
Well, the story begins in 1955. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which was an absolute titan of American industry at the time, opens the Berkeley Pit.
So Anaconda starts it all.
Right. And Anaconda wasn't just a company in Montana. They essentially owned the state's economy and politics. For nearly 3 decades, they blast and dig, removing a literal mountain of copper ore to feed the post-war electrification of America.
A literal mountain?
Yeah, the pit grows to massive proportions, swallowing up whole neighborhoods of Butte. But by the mid-1970s, Anaconda is struggling terribly.
Why?
They're facing financial ruin, largely because their incredibly lucrative mining assets in South America had been nationalized, and their corporate end was clearly near.
Okay, so this is the critical moment where the liability could have vanished. If Anaconda just goes completely bankrupt and dissolves in the 1970s, before the Superfund law is even a concept in Congress, the story ends there. The public just inherits the pit.
They were teetering on the edge of exactly that. But they didn't dissolve into nothing. In 1976 and 1977, they were acquired by the Atlantic Richfield Company, or ARCO.
Wait, aren't they an oil company?
An oil company, yes. ARCO was a massive, incredibly wealthy oil company. They bought Anaconda's holdings because, at the time, oil companies were flush with cash and looking to diversify into other hard rock minerals.
Oh, wow.
It was a period of corporate hubris where oil giants thought they could run mining empires just because they had money.
So ARCO buys the company and they buy the mine. They probably thought they were getting a deal on the copper reserves.
They bought the physical assets, but crucially, under corporate law, they bought the history.
The liability virus.
Exactly. When CERCLA passes a few years later in 1980, creating that strict, joint, and several retroactive liability we discussed, ARCO is suddenly standing in Anaconda's shoes.
Wow.
The new federal law looks at ARCO, an oil company, and says, you are now the legally responsible party for a century of toxic mining waste in Butte.
And then shortly after that, the mining actually stops, right? Because the economics just didn't work anymore.
Yeah, in 1982, the economics of the global copper market tanked. The Berkeley Pit officially ceased operations, And this is the critical physical and chemical moment for the environment.
Because they stopped pumping the water.
Exactly. When a massive open pit mine is operating, it acts like a giant drain. You have to constantly run massive industrial pumps to keep the groundwater out of the pit so the miners and the machines can get to the rock at the bottom.
Makes sense.
When ARCO closed the mine in 1982, they shut off the pumps.
So if they shut the pumps off, gravity just takes over, right? The water table naturally rebounds. It starts filling up this 900-foot hole.
The water table rebounds, yes, but it's not just clean mountain water filling an empty stone cup.
Right.
When you mine for copper on that scale, you expose massive amounts of sulfide-bearing rock to oxygen for the first time in geological history.
And oxygen plus sulfides equals.
When the groundwater rises and hits that highly oxidized sulfide rock, a violent chemical reaction occurs. It creates acid rust drainage.
Okay, so what does that actually mean for the water?
The water chemically alters. It turns into a highly acidic solution that then strips and dissolves the heavy metals out of the surrounding rock.
Ah, the warm lemon juice we were talking about earlier, laced with arsenic and cadmium.
Precisely that. So the pit starts filling with millions of gallons of this heavy metal acid. The surrounding area, the Silver Bow Creek and Butte area, becomes one of the largest, most complex Superfund complexes in the entire United States.
It's just a colossal mess.
The EPA lists it on the National Priorities List. The looming liability is astronomical.
But RSLO is a giant oil company. They have money, they are solvent, they can't just claim they are broke like the dummy LLC in our apartment analogy.
They were highly solvent. And then the corporate chain gets even longer and even deeper pockets get involved.
Who comes next?
In the year 2000, BP British Petroleum acquires RSLO.
BP, another massive global oil giant. So now BP owns the history of Anaconda.
BP buys URSO, and in doing so, they inherit the Superfund obligations across the American West, including the Berkeley Pit in Butte.
That is incredible.
The liability virus survives 3 distinct corporate eras. Anaconda made the mess, ERCO bought it, BP inherited it.
So what happens when the government finally comes to collect? Because we are talking about a lake of acid that constantly threatens the entire regional watershed. Like, if that pit overflows, it poisons the Clark Fork River basin.
Well, the legal pressure culminated in March 2002. The Department of Justice, the EPA, and the state of Montana reached a massive settlement. It was a formal consent decree with RRCO, along with Montana Resources and other parties, to legally bind them to control the drainage of the pit.
Okay, for those who aren't lawyers, what exactly is a consent decree?
A consent decree is essentially a legally binding settlement agreement approved by a judge. It resolves a dispute between parties without an admission of guilt, but it comes with strict court-enforced mandates to perform specific actions or pay specific amounts.
So it's not a suggestion?
No, if you violate a consent decree, you are in contempt of court.
Okay, so what were the actual dollar figures on that 2002 decree for the Berkeley Pit?
The settlement secured roughly $87 million to build and operate facilities to capture and treat the pit's water, ensuring it stays at a safe level and cannot escape into Butte's groundwater, the Silver Bow Creek, or the Clark Fork River.
$87 million.
And the official EPA estimates at the time noted that the total pit-related control costs over time could eventually reach roughly $110 million.
Okay, I really want to pause here for a second because when I was reading through the source dossier, I remembered seeing this really scandalous headline circulating a while back.
Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, something about a secretive deal that let BP off the hook. The headline was something like, EPA struck secretive deal over toxic site, leaving $13 million in BP's pocket. Did that happen at the Berkeley Pit? Did BP somehow weasel out of the 2002 settlement we just talked about?
I am very glad you brought that up because our sources are very careful to clarify this point, and we have to be forensic about separating these events.
Okay, separate them for me.
That specific headline and that $13 million figure refers to a completely different, much later episode in a different state.
Oh, really? It had nothing to do with Butte.
Nothing to do with the Berkeley Pit.
Yeah.
That headline was about a 2017 to 2018 arrangement involving the Anaconda copper mine site near Yerington, Nevada.
Oh, Nevada, not Montana.
Right. It was a controversial deal made under the EPA's Superfund task force at the time to hand primary oversight of the Nevada site over to the state authorities. Critics argued that the maneuvering reportedly relieved IRCO and BP of about $13 million owed for past EPA oversight costs.
Okay.
But regardless of the politics of that Nevada deal, It is a completely separate legal and financial issue from the 2002 Berkeley Pit settlement in Montana.
Okay, that is a really crucial clarification for the timeline. The $13 million scandal is Nevada in 2018. The $87 million binding settlement is Montana in 2002.
Yeah.
So let's look at the Butte settlement as a whole. The government used Superfund. They traced the liability back through 3 megacorporations. They got an $87 million consent decree from highly solvent companies.
Yes, they did.
The polluter, or rather the polluter's wealthy great-grandchild, actually paid. So, Superfund worked, right? The system functioned exactly as Congress intended in 1980.
Well, it forces us to define what working actually means in environmental law.
Fair point.
Yes. At Butte, a solvent successor was found and made to pay. The American taxpayers didn't have to foot the entire $87 million bill up front to build the treatment plant.
Which is a win.
It is. But the crucial, terrifying takeaway from our sources is that Butte is the exception, not the rule.
Right.
The public was saved in this specific instance only by an incredibly lucky, unbroken chain of acquisitions by megacorporations. If Anaconda hadn't been bought by an oil giant, or if REO had spun the Butte mine off into a doomed shell company like we discussed in the corporate playbook earlier, the public would have paid for every single drop of that acid water.
Right, because IRCO and BP were simply too big, too public, and too profitable to use the bankruptcy escape hatch. They couldn't hide.
Exactly. Furthermore, even with the $87 million settlement, we have to look at what the engineered solution actually is.
The treatment plant.
Yeah, the money isn't going to fix the Berkeley Pit. It isn't going to make the water clean again, or restore the mountain to its natural state, or bring back the snow geese. The solution they funded is perpetual water treatment.
Perpetual. As in forever.
They have to pump and chemically treat that acidic water forever so it doesn't overflow into the drinking water aquifer. It is a permanent maintenance obligation, not a finished, closed-book cleanup. The environment is permanently, irreversibly altered.
Perpetual water treatment. Those 3 words just sound so incredibly heavy. It really hammers home that even when the legal chain holds perfectly, you can't put the toxic toothpaste back in the tube.
No, you can't.
But you said Butte was the lucky exception. If BP is the anomaly, what is the baseline? What happens when the corporate escape hatch actually works as intended? Like, let's look at when the chain snaps.
To see the mechanism succeeding in shifting the burden to the public, we need to look at 2 other major cases detailed heavily in our sources: the Summitville mine in Colorado and the Gilt Edge mine in South Dakota.
Okay, let's break those down.
Both were massive gold mines. Both utilized large-scale cyanide processes. And both were successfully abandoned by their corporate parents when the economics turned sour.
Let's start with Summitville in Colorado. Walk me through what happened there.
Summitville was operated by a subsidiary of a Canadian mining corporation called Galactic Resources.
Galactic Resources.
Yeah. They were running a massive cyanide, heap leach gold mine high up in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado in a harsh alpine environment.
Just to make sure we are all on the same page, what exactly is cyanide heap leaching? It sounds intense, and I want to understand the physical process before we talk about the failure.
It is a highly industrial, massive-scale chemical process.
Okay.
In historical mining, you dug tunnels to follow rich veins of gold. But modern mining often targets microscopic flakes of gold spread across millions of tons of rock.
So they aren't looking for nuggets.
No, it's basically dust. So instead of digging tunnels, you blast open a pit, mine huge amounts of low-grade ore, and pile it up into massive mounds or heaps on top of plastic liners.
Like a literal mountain of gravel.
A literal mountain. Then you continuously drip a sodium cyanide chemical solution over the top of the mountain of rock.
Cyanide.
Yes. The cyanide slowly percolates through the rock, chemically binding with the microscopic flecks of gold. You then collect the gold-bearing cyanide solution at the bottom, strip the gold out, and recycle the cyanide back to the top.
So you were basically pressure washing an entire mountain of crushed rock with cyanide to get the microscopic gold out.
That's a very accurate way to visualize it.
That sounds like an engineering marvel, but also an absolute environmental tightrope walk. Like, what could possibly go wrong in a high-altitude mountain range?
At Summitville, essentially everything went wrong.
Oh, no.
The operations were struggling financially and technically, slowly winding down through 1991 and 1992. The site was plagued by leaks and water management issues, and then in December of 1992, right in the middle of a brutal, high-altitude Rocky Mountain winter, the operating subsidiary simply notified the state of Colorado that it was declaring bankruptcy and abandoning the site entirely.
Wait, they just walked away midwinter. Who was running the pumps?
No one. They walked away. and they left behind a massive cyanide-laden leach pad that was rapidly filling with snowmelt and precipitation.
Because it's winter in Colorado.
Right. The contaminated water was rising dangerously close to its emergency spillway. The EPA actually had to rush in and execute an emergency takeover of the site under Superfund authority just to prevent a catastrophic structural blowout of the cyanide ponds.
Wow. So the government just caught it before it burst.
They did, but the environmental damage was already profound. Acid rock drainage and heavy metals had already leaked extensively, creating a roughly 17-mile biological dead zone along the Alamosa River.
A 17-mile dead zone where nothing can live. That is tragic. And because the operating company went bankrupt and the parent company was shielded by the corporate veil, there was no solvent party for the EPA to hand the bill to.
Exactly. Summitville is considered by many in the industry and environmental circles as the canonical orphan mine disaster of the modern era.
Because the escape hatch worked perfectly.
It worked perfectly. The company walked, the corporate veil held, and the public caught the site mid-failure. The reported cleanup and ongoing water treatment costs ran well over $100 million, the vast majority of it borne by the public ledger.
And the other site you mentioned, Gilt Edge in South Dakota, does it follow the same playbook?
An eerily similar playbook. Gilt Edge was operated by Brom Mining, which was a subsidiary of another company called Dakota Mining. It was another open-pit cyanide heap leach gold operation, this time located in the northern Black Hills of South Dakota.
Okay, so same setup, subsidiary and parent company.
Yep. In 1999, faced with mounting environmental problems and low gold prices, both the subsidiary and the parent company became insolvent.
So the escape hatch is deployed again, the corporate entities die, and the liability is severed. What did they leave behind in the Black Hills?
The physical legacy was staggering. They left behind roughly 150 million gallons of highly acidic, heavy metal-laden water sitting completely untreated in open pits, along with millions of cubic yards of acid-generating waste rock.
Wait, I just want to sit with that number. 150 million gallons?
Yeah.
150 million gallons of acid water left sitting in a pit for the government to find. But here is where my mind really gets stuck. As I was reading the dossier on these two sites, I noticed something crucial. Both Summitville and Gilt Edge were modern enough that they actually had reclamation bonds in place. Right?
It did have bonds, yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't like the 1800s where people just dug a hole and vanished. The government required them to put down a financial deposit, a bond, before they started digging, specifically to prevent this exact scenario of abandonment. So, if they had bonds sitting in a government bank account, why did the public still pay hundreds of millions of dollars?
That points to the pivotal systemic flaw in the modern bonding system. Yes, they had bonds, but a financial bond is only as good as the math used to calculate it on day one.
Okay, so the math was wrong.
The recurring lesson across these sites, and many others, is that the bonds were calculated and set far, far below the true, realistic cost of a catastrophic cleanup and long-term water treatment.
Why are they so low? Are the regulators just bad at math? Or is industry pressuring them to keep the bonds low so they can actually afford to open the mine?
It is a mix of regulatory pressure, optimistic engineering assumptions, and, most importantly, a fundamental, almost philosophical problem with how human beings price environmental damage over time.
How so?
Well, when a mine goes bankrupt and leaves behind acid rock drainage, the resulting cleanup is not a simple one-time construction project. You don't just hire a crew, build a concrete wall, cap the site, and walk away.
Right, because of the chemistry.
Exactly.
Okay.
As we discussed with the Berkeley Pit, acid mine drainage is a perpetual chemical process. It requires perpetual active water treatment.
You have to run the water treatment plant every single day forever.
And this is where the financial mechanics completely break down. How do you mathematically price infinity into a finite financial security bond?
Oh, wow.
If a site requires millions of dollars a year in electricity, chemicals, and labor for water treatment forever, how large does the upfront bond need to be to cover that?
I mean, you'd need a bond so massive that the principal amount generates enough annual interest to pay for the millions in water treatment into eternity without ever touching the principal.
Correct.
Which would be hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars up front, which would make the mine completely unprofitable to open in the first place. No bank would finance it.
That is the core economic contradiction. You cannot price forever into a finite bond without killing the project. So historically, the bonds fell massively short.
That makes total sense. Terrifying, but it makes sense.
Now, at Gilt Edge, to be fair to the system, the EPA did later manage to recover over $30 million from various former operators and affiliated parties through litigation.
So they got some of it back.
It was a partial clawback.
Yeah.
But the massive interim treatment costs, the emergency stabilization, and the permanent infinite environmental maintenance inevitably falls to the only permanent entity left standing that cannot go bankrupt.
Federal government.
The federal government.
Okay, this brings us to a massive, screaming policy question.
Let's hear it.
If state-level bonds are failing because they are mathematically too small, and if corporate bankruptcies are allowing companies to legally walk away and shift the massive remaining cost to taxpayers, why hasn't the federal government simply changed the rules? Like, why hasn't the EPA forced mining companies to prove with absolute certainty at the federal level that they have the money to cover catastrophic perpetual cleanup before they are allowed to strike ground?
That exact question is the hinge of modern environmental policy for this industry. And what the dossier reveals is that Congress actually intended to do exactly what you were suggesting when they wrote Superfund in 1980.
They did.
Yes. There is a specific, somewhat obscure section of CERC law known as Section 108B. This section explicitly directed the EPA to require classes of facilities, including hard rock mines, to demonstrate federal financial responsibility.
Meaning they have to prove to the EPA upfront that they can pay for the absolute worst-case Superfund scenario.
Yes, a federal backstop to ensure that even if the corporate veil is used, the money is already sitting in a secure instrument. But for decades, from 1980 well into the 2000s, the EPA never actually wrote the specific rule for the hard rock mining industry.
Wait, they were directed by federal statute to write the rule and they just didn't?
They never implemented Section 108B.
For nearly 40 years, how does a federal agency just ignore a law?
Regulatory inertia, intense lobbying, changing administrations, and, the sheer complexity of calculating those infinite costs all played a role.
So it just sat there.
The mandate sat dormant. It wasn't until the EPA was forced by a massive lawsuit from environmental litigators, specifically Earth Justice and Earthworks, and placed on a strict court-ordered schedule, that the agency finally acted to evaluate the rule.
Okay, so they were forced by a federal judge to finally write the rule. This is the moment. This is where the escape hatch finally gets bolted shut by the federal government, right?
No.
No.
In February 2018, the EPA issued its final decision under the court mandate. And their official decision was not to impose Section 108B financial responsibility rules for the hard rock mining industry.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. They were sued to write a rule. They spent years and millions of dollars evaluating it. And their final published rule was basically, we've decided we don't need a rule.
That is exactly what happened. The Federal Register notice, published in 2018, stated that the degree and duration of risk from modern hard rock operations does not warrant federal financial responsibility rules under the Superfund law.
Wow.
And to finalize it, in 2019, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the EPA's decision and upheld it. The court ruled the EPA was within its rights to interpret the risk that way.
Okay, we need to look at both sides of this decision fairly and neutrally, because this is the absolute keystone policy debate in our dossier. It's the moment the modern rules of the game were set.
It really is.
So on one hand, you have the critics who sued the EPA. What is their fundamental argument for why this was a disastrous decision?
The critics, led by environmental groups like Earth Justice, argue that this non-decision essentially leaves the corporate escape hatch wide open for the next generation of mines.
By not requiring the federal bond.
Right. They argue that by refusing to require federal upfront financial assurance, the EPA is actively choosing to protect the balance sheets of multinational mining companies at the direct expense of the American taxpayer.
And they probably point to the abandoned mines as proof.
Exactly. They point to the massive multi-billion-dollar backlog of orphan sites like Summitville and Gilt Edge, and they say, look at the empirical evidence. The current state-level system is failing. And without a federal Superfund bond, the public will inevitably pay for the next failure.
And the mining industry's view. Because they aren't just cartoon villains, they have lawyers and economists. What is the logical structural argument against requiring this federal financial assurance? Why do they say they shouldn't have to put up the money?
The industry's countervailing view is rooted in the reality of modern overlapping regulation. They argue that a new federal 108B rule would be completely redundant and economically destructive.
Redundant, ow.
They point out that modern mines operating today are already heavily bonded under various federal land management programs. If you mine on public land, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service require comprehensive reclamation bonds.
Okay.
And if you mine on state or private land, State environmental agencies have strict bonding programs.
So the industry is essentially saying, we already put down tens of millions in bonds for the state of Nevada or the BLM in Utah. We don't need a third, completely redundant layer of federal bonding from the EPA just to prove the same thing.
Correct. They argue that a duplicative EPA bond would tie up massive amounts of vital capital unnecessarily, making new domestic mining projects financially unviable.
Which they argue kills jobs.
Yes, which would kill jobs and force the U.S. to rely on foreign minerals. Furthermore, the industry makes a very compelling historical point.
What's that?
They argue that the catastrophic sites everyone points to, the Berkeley Pit, Summitville, Gilt Edge, those disasters predate modern state-of-the-art mining requirements and modern engineering practices. They are legacy issues from a less regulated era. A new 108B rule applied only to new mines opening today wouldn't retroactively fix the Berkeley Pit anyway.
I see the structure of the debate now. It's really a debate about the timeline of risk. The critics are looking at the past and saying, we need an ironclad federal guarantee to prevent the next Summitville from happening in 20 years. And the industry is saying, Summitville happened under old rules. Modern engineering and existing state bonds prevent that kind of failure now, so your new federal rule is just redundant red tape punishing modern operators.
That captures the tension perfectly. It is a fundamental, ongoing debate between preventing theoretical future front-end disasters versus managing the very real legacy cleanup. In 2018, the EPA ultimately sided with the industry's argument that the modern regulatory landscape, even with its historical flaws, has matured enough that a blanket federal Superfund bond is unnecessary.
But regardless of who is right about the safety of future mines, this debate over redundant bonding only really matters to the taxpayer today because of the sheer terrifying scale of the mess that has already been left behind by the broken corporate chains of the past.
That's the real problem.
The legacy mess is still sitting there.
And the scale of that legacy mess is almost incomprehensible. It is an inherited burden that spans the entire American West, lingering in almost every major watershed.
Let's get into the hard numbers. Our dossier relies heavily on a comprehensive 2020 report from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which acts as the supreme auditor for the federal government.
The watchdog.
Right. So paint the picture for me. How many abandoned mines are we actually talking about in the United States?
To give you the full context, commonly cited estimates across various federal and state agencies suggest there are roughly 500,000 or more abandoned mines of all types nationally.
500,000.
500,000. But that includes coal, sand, gravel, etc. But if we narrow our focus strictly to hard rock mines, the ones that produce copper, gold, silver, uranium, the ones that generate the toxic acid drainage we've been discussing, the GAO documented approximately 140,000 abandoned hard rock mine features on federal land alone.
140,000 features. And just to be precise, what does the GAO consider a feature? Is that 140,000 separate Berkeley pits?
No, thankfully not. A feature can be anything from a massive open pit or a highly toxic tailings impoundment down to a smaller draining tunnel known as an adit or an abandoned vertical shaft.
Okay, so a wide range of sizes.
Yes. But even a small draining adit can continuously pump heavy metals into a local stream for centuries. And remember, that 140,000 number is only what has been officially cataloged on land managed by federal agencies.
There's more.
The GAO report notes there are potentially hundreds of thousands more features that are simply uncaptured in agency inventories, lost time on private or state land.
So what is this vast inventory of abandoned toxic features costing us right now, just to keep a lid on it and prevent catastrophic blowouts?
The GAO audited the spending, and they found that between fiscal years 2008 and 2017, federal agencies, primarily the Forest Service, the BLM, and the EPA, spent an average of $287 million every single year just addressing abandoned hard rock mine hazards.
$287 million a year. That is a massive annual sink of public funds.
Over that 10-year period, it totaled roughly $2.9 billion. And crucially, about 88% of that spending was focused directly on environmental hazards, like mitigating toxic water and chemical contamination, rather than just filling in open shafts for physical safety.
And of that $2.9 billion spent over a decade, how much did the government manage to claw back from the companies who actually made the mess, using Superfund or litigation?
Of that $2.9 billion, only about $1 billion was reimbursed by private responsible parties.
So the rest?
Almost $2 billion in just one decade came directly from the public treasury.
So what does this all mean for the person listening to this deep dive? It means that you, whether you realize it or not, are effectively functioning as the ultimate unpaid insurance policy for century-old industrial operations.
You absolutely are.
Every time you pay your federal taxes, a fraction of a cent goes to pumping acid out of a hole in Montana or Colorado that was dug by a company that ceased to exist before you were even born. And that $2.9 billion is just the maintenance cost over 10 years. What is the estimate to actually clean all of this up permanently?
This is where we have to be very careful and forensic with the numbers, because they get thrown around a lot in political debates.
Yeah.
You will frequently see a figure quoted in the press, roughly $50 billion for total national cleanup.
50 billion with a B. That is a staggering liability.
It is. But as a forensic analysis of the sources requires, we must clarify that this $50 billion figure is not a formally audited, itemized bill.
It's an estimate.
Right. No single federal agency has gone to all 140,000 sites, drilled test wells, engineered a solution, and run a perfect cost analysis. The GAO actually faulted federal agencies in a subsequent 2023 report for not tracking or reporting total cleanup costs consistently. So that $50 billion is best framed as an order of magnitude estimate, cobbled together from various state and federal projections.
But even if it's an estimate, the GAO confirms the real number is massive, right? They aren't saying the real number is zero.
Absolutely not. The GAO explicitly confirms that the true cost to address the remaining features will be, in their exact words, billions more. Whether the final audited bill is $20 billion, $50 billion, or $70 billion, the scale of the public liability is astronomical, and it is largely unfunded.
Okay. So we have a broken chain of historical liability. We have bankruptcy functioning as a perfectly legal, engineered escape hatch. We have a 2018 EPA decision that actively chose not to require upfront federal financial assurance for new mines. And we have tens of billions of dollars in unfunded perpetual cleanup costs staring us in the face.
It's a grim picture.
It feels incredibly bleak. But our dossier does point to one very recent legislative attempt to at least chip away at this backlog on the ground. Let's talk about the 2024 Good Samaritan Act.
With billions in cleanup needed and the original corporate polluters long gone, the government desperately needed a new strategy to get actual physical remediation work done on the ground. Enter the Good Samaritan Remediation of Abandoned Hard Rock Mines Act, which was signed into federal law very recently on December 17, 2024.
What does this act actually do? How does it help move the needle on those 140,000 features?
It addresses a bizarre, deeply frustrating, unintended consequence of the original Superfund law.
Okay.
Remember how we said circle liability is incredibly aggressive? Strict, joint, and several retroactive.
Right. The liability virus?
Well, that aggressive liability doesn't just scare away polluters, it also completely paralyzes volunteers.
Oh, I see where this is going. If a nonprofit conservation group like Trout Unlimited, for example, wants to go in and clean up an abandoned mine to save a trout stream, Superfund might look at them and say, "You touched it, you own it, now you are liable for everything forever."
That is exactly the legal trap. For decades, highly capable NGOs, state agencies, and conservation groups have desperately wanted to go into these orphan sites and do partial cleanups.
Like what?
Maybe reroute a clean stream away from a toxic tailings pile or cap a small draining at it. But their general counsel lawyers told them absolutely, categorically not.
Because of the liability.
Because under the strict framework of the Clean Water Act in Berkeley, if you try to fix a leaking mine and you don't achieve perfect, pristine water quality standards, you can be sued as a responsible party simply for touching the site and altering the flow. You legally inherit the liability of the original polluter.
So the strict environmental law meant to punish the worst polluters was actually punishing the people actively trying to clean up the pollution.
Yes.
That is peak regulatory irony. It creates total paralysis. So how does the new Good Samaritan Act fix this?
The Good Samaritan Act creates a highly controlled federal pilot program. Under the new law, the EPA can issue up to 15 pilot permits over a 7-year window to qualified third parties.
The Good Samaritans.
Right. These are legally defined as entities who never owned, operated, or caused the waste at the site.
So they have to prove an absolute lack of historical connection to the mess.
Correct. No corporate ties. And if they secure this permit, they can go in and execute their specific remediation work without inheriting the terrifying strict Circle A or Clean Water Act liability for the historical contamination.
Oh, that's huge.
They are only held liable for the specific, targeted work they undertake, and they have to carry financial assurance for their own small project. but they do not buy the historical sins of the entire site.
That sounds incredibly pragmatic. It removes the legal fear, stopping good work. It's genuinely bipartisan legislation, right?
It is widely welcomed across the political spectrum, from mining industry advocates to conservationists. It allows good, tangible work to happen on the ground that was previously blocked by bureaucratic fear.
That's a good thing.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of our entire deep dive today, we have to evaluate what this policy actually achieves on a macro-systemic level.
Right, because it's a pilot program for a maximum of 15 sites over 7 years. And we just established there are 140,000 abandoned features on federal land alone. 15 sites is a drop in the ocean.
The Good Samaritan Act is a fantastic step for those 15 watersheds, but it only treats a symptom of the broken system. The symptom is that well-meaning volunteers are terrified of inheriting liability.
Right.
The Act cures that specific fear for a few pilot projects, but it does absolutely nothing to address the root cause of the crisis.
Which is the escape hatch we spent the first half of this deep dive exploring.
Yes, the root cause is the underlying lack of guaranteed upfront financial responsibility that allows massive mining operations to age, fail, enter bankruptcy, and become orphaned in the first place. The Good Samaritan Act might help clean up a few small legacy messes, but it doesn't stop the economic and legal system from generating new ones.
Wow, okay. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We started by looking at the incredibly strict intentions of the Superfund law, a law designed with ironclad, retroactive, joint, and several liability to ensure that the polluter always pays.
But then we saw how corporate structure, dummy LLCs, and the strategic use of bankruptcy create a perfectly legal escape hatch, isolating toxic assets in undercapitalized shell companies and shifting the burden to unsecured debt.
And we traced the incredible century-long corporate genealogy of Anaconda, ARCO, and BP at the Berkeley Pit in Butte, Montana, seeing how the legal chain only held because the successors were massive oil giants too large and public to fail.
And we contrasted that anomaly with the grim reality of Summitville and Gilt Edge, where the corporate chain snapped midwinter, dumping the catastrophic perpetual costs of cyanide processing and acid mine drainage squarely onto the taxpayers because finite bonds cannot cover infinite water treatment.
We examined the hinge of modern environmental policy, the EPA's 2018 decision to leave Section 108B dormant, accepting the industry's compelling argument that modern state bonds are sufficient, despite the critics' warning that this maintains the exact loophole that created the massive legacy backlog.
A legacy backlog that the GAO estimates could eventually cost the public tens of billions of dollars, while partial, pragmatic fixes like the Good Samaritan Act try to plug a crumbling dam with just 15 pilot permits. It is a staggering labyrinth of liability and chemistry.
It truly is. And as we conclude our analysis of these sources, it leaves us with a forward-looking reality that society at large has to confront immediately.
It does.
What is that reality?
Well, we are currently undergoing a massive, rapid global transition to green energy. Electric vehicles, vast solar arrays, wind turbine farms, grid-scale battery storage.
Right, and every single piece of that infrastructure requires staggering amounts of metals.
This transition requires unprecedented levels of new hard rock mining. We're going to need exponentially more copper, more lithium, more cobalt, more rare earth elements than human history has ever demanded before.
Which means more holes.
We are about to start digging a lot of new, massive holes in the ground.
So the provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over today is this. As we race to build the massive mines of tomorrow to fuel a cleaner, greener, electrified future, how do we ensure that those new operations don't utilize the exact same legal and corporate escape hatches of the past? When the copple for your electric car runs out in 50 years and the operating LLC quietly declares bankruptcy, who is going to pay to treat the water?
It's a huge problem.
Can our corporate legal systems, which are inherently and legally focused on maximizing quarterly profits and limiting investor liability, ever truly account for an environmental cost that lasts forever?
It is arguably the defining environmental and economic question of the next century.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Uncosted West and the labyrinth of environmental liability. Next time you see a flock of birds passing overhead on a crisp fall day, take a moment to think about the water they are landing in and who exactly is paying to keep it clean. Until next time.